Good morning. This is Ronald Piccirilli here for HIS 705, the public history class. I'm here at Fort Laramie National Historic Site in Wyoming, and we're going to take a little tour of Fort Laramie National Historic Site and see what's here, because it's a very interesting and historic place. Here, I'm going to give our viewers a panoramic view of Fort Laramie and the buildings that are left here in the year 2020. As you can see, we have a few buildings left, and we will be taking a look at them momentarily. Here we're going to see a map of Fort Laramie and the buildings that we will be visiting. Hello, this is Ronald Piccirilli again, and we're at Fort Laramie National Historic Site. Because of COVID-19, the visitor center is closed, but I wanted to show my viewers that Fort Laramie was once quite a large place. As you can see from this map, there were a lot of buildings that are no longer standing here now. And we'll investigate some of the historic areas and the buildings that are existent. One thing is that the fort was built by the U.S. government without walls. It was purposely built that way. Here we are on the oldest part of Fort Laramie. Fort Laramie was built on a river called the Laramie River, of all things, and we will see the river here in a moment and the successive bridges that were built over the Laramie River. Here is a sign at the National Historic Site talking about the Army bridges that were here at one point, and I will take you over to the Laramie River. Here we see the Laramie River, and as you can see, it's fairly deep in the middle, I guess, probably about 4 feet. But this is the only source of water for a long way, and this is its reason for existing here in this spot. And the area that you can see directly in front of you is where the old Army bridges were constructed, and they're gone now. They've been washed away and deteriorated over time. And this is where the emigrants that were arriving over the Oregon Trail came through to get to Fort Laramie. The Oregon Trail was here at the time when Fort Laramie was first built. It was first built as a small post to trade furs in called Fort John, but that was demolished at the time the federal government purchased Fort Laramie about the year 1850, and then constructed an army barracks and other things here. And immigrants still came over the Oregon Trail at that time, and they used Fort Laramie as a welcome relief point, and they would get supplies here and fix any wagons or wagon tongues and things like that they needed on their wagons as they traveled the Oregon Trail. Like most 19th century military posts, Fort Laramie was built around a parade ground where the soldiers would drill during different times of the day and have roll call and musters. And here's the parade ground and the buildings that are around it. And you could see Old Glory up there on the existing flagpole. Here we have some of the non-existent buildings, but you can see the foundations and the ruins and the sign for company barracks. And right, if I get you over here, you can see the foundations of the company barracks, which were right next to the parade ground. Here's one of the buildings in Fort Laramie that has not been reconstructed. These are original ruins of buildings here for soldiers as part of the soldier fort. You can see they're fairly extensive. And you can see some of the construction here, made with stucco and concrete looking stuff. We are to explain a little bit about what Fort Laramie was like before the federal government purchased the existing fort that was here. Fort Laramie started as a fur trading post in the 1830s, but evolved into a little bit more. Instead of just trading beaver furs, they wanted Native Americans to come to trade for buffalo robes. And they would trade things to the Plains Indian tribes for the buffalo robes, which were then shipped back east to make blankets for people that would ride in sleighs, and they would make jackets and things out of them. Here's what the original Fort William and then Fort John looked like before the federal government purchased it. You can see that it is a fort with a stockade around it, and they wanted Native Americans to come. And here's one of the interpretive signs about Fort William and the fur trade. And then, as the trade started to grow, especially with people coming over the overland trail system, Fort William was changed to Fort John, and it looked like this in the interpretive signs. And then in 1849, the federal government bought the land and let Fort John be demolished, and they built Fort Laramie. One of the neat things about Fort Laramie is that since not all buildings have been restored, you can see the ruins and the remains of buildings that were once here. Here in this area, we see a fenced off place, and this looks like a root cellar or some kind of basement, probably. I'm guessing it's a root cellar of a building that's no longer here. So you can kind of imagine what was once here. It's pretty interesting. Here we are outside an officer's headquarters building. The building was built in the year 1858, but it became a little bit different as the years went on, when it was remodeled a bit. And as we go inside, we'll see the furnishings are very Victorian-like. As we walk inside this officer's headquarters building, we notice where the officers lived. And here is their parlor for an officer, and you can see some of the period furnishings from the late 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, I guess. And it's very Victorian looking because that was the style at the time. But as we'll see here in a moment at the parade ground, when the emigrants stopped using the Oregon Trail very often, and there's just they got to be few and far between. The post became kind of like a Victorian outpost here in the Great Plains, and it survived that way until 1890. In the 1870s, when there wasn't all that much to do here at Fort Laramie, but it was still a military outpost, the government and the commanders of the post did some refinements to it, and they planted a lot of trees around the parade ground, some of which are to be seen today. But they also had gas lighting here at Fort Laramie, and as we'll see here in a moment, this little thing is a bird bath that they made along the parade ground, and they were at the corners of the parade ground, and they planted flowers around the perimeter of the parade ground just because it was just something nice to do, and they wanted to beautify the parade ground here on the Great Plains. Here behind me are some unrestored officers' quarters, and you get the look of them here, and they were around the parade ground. And in back of me is the only restored bachelor officers' quarters, and it was nicknamed Old Bedlam because they sometimes had raucous parties there. But you can see that the buildings are built around the parade ground. There's the parade ground in the background, and that was the center of Fort Laramie. In Wyoming history, we have a person named John Portuguese Phillips, who is fairly famous, and what he did was in the year 1866, what he did was he rode all the way from Fort Kearny, which is in the northern part of Wyoming near the town of Sheridan, and he came to Fort Laramie to ask for the urgent assistance of troops because the garrison of Fort Kearny had just been massacred outside the fort by Native Americans. And here is a plaque for John Portuguese Phillips, who rode 236 miles in snowstorms to tell the garrison here at Fort Laramie that the garrison at Fort Kearny had been massacred by Native Americans and the fort was in imminent peril. Fort Laramie again, outside the Post Settlers store. And they conducted trading with Native Americans, and mostly what the Native Americans wanted to exchange here were buffalo robes. And it was pretty interesting how they traded buffalo robes for things that they could only purchase at this settler store that's behind me. Behind me is the restored cavalry barracks here at Fort Laramie. They had a few companies of cavalrymen that would give shelter to, and they would ride out to patrol the parts of the Oregon Trail and also the Bozeman Trail north. The cavalry barracks here is restored. This is where the cavalrymen lived. Also behind me, you can see farther out that way, is where the famous 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed with 10 different bands of Lakota Indians, and they would have signed that way, and probably in a building for the quartermaster that is not existent right now, but they were camped back that way, right across by those trees back there. And The Crow Indians that also signed the famous 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie would have been encamped behind us in another field. There we see way in the background there, that way past those trees. That's where the Crow Indians would have camped, and they signed out in the fields for this Treaty of Fort Laramie. It wasn't that the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie was so bad. It was not discriminatory. It was not an unequal treaty. It's just that it wasn't enforced very well. The parts of it that were enforced were the Native Americans were sent to go onto reservations, but they would have access to their hunting lands, especially the Black Hills. Since gold was found in the Black Hills after 1868, a lot of people that went to the Black Hills just to find gold and get rich quick, and they started settling in the Black Hills, which were, by this treaty, belonged to the Native Americans. And that caused a lot of problems with Native Americans and the cavalry here in Fort Laramie, and was often sent out to enforce the Native Americans going to the Black Hills, going to the reservations. And then soon after, you would have the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn in the early 1870s, and that was part of the kind of fallout from this Treaty of Fort Laramie that was signed right here in Fort Laramie. We're in a part of Fort Laramie here. In fact, it's our last stop, and it's a part of Fort Laramie that most people just ignore and don't come to. This is the Post Hospital, or the ruins of the Post Hospital. The Post Hospital is actually 3 stories tall, as you could tell from the background up there. It was a state-of-the-art hospital and was in use from the 1860s all the way until 1890, when Fort Laramie was abandoned by the federal government and the fort actually closed as a military base. Afterwards, the buildings were mostly either purchased by local people and hauled away to some of the local towns, or they were left to deteriorate here on site. And the Post Hospital is one of them. You can't really move this large building here, but you can see in the background what I've got over here is some other parts of the Post Hospital that were there. There's an auxiliary wing, so patients could get well soon, I suppose, with the good air of the Great Plains. So I thank you for coming to Fort Laramie with me and to explore Fort Laramie and its place in local and national history.